Ethan had always been close to his mother, Maggie. She was a kind and loving woman who raised him with compassion and care after his father left them when Ethan was just a baby. Despite the challenges, they had always been a team. But when Maggie passed away unexpectedly at the age of 56, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It didn't make sense. His mother had always been healthy, and it didn't seem like she had any serious health issues. Her sudden death left Ethan with more questions than answers. One evening, just days after the funeral, Ethan found himself standing in front of his mother's grave. The deep sadness that had been gnawing at his heart suddenly morphed into an unsettling feeling of suspicion. He needed to know the truth. Why did Maggie die so suddenly? Was it really a heart attack as the doctors had claimed? Or was there something more sinister at play? He knew it wasn't normal to dig up someone's grave, but the thought of never knowing the truth, of never being able to look his mother in the eye again, was unbearable. Maggie deserved to be remembered with dignity, not as a victim of some hidden truth. That night, Ethan made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't let go of the unanswered questions. He had to find out. Ethan's mind raced as he clutched the shovel in his hand. He had spent years away at university, focused on his studies. But now, standing here in front of the grave, he felt like a stranger in his own life. He barely even recognized the young man he had become. All the years of hard work, of planning for a future, seemed meaningless when his mother, the most important person in his life, was taken away so suddenly. He felt as though he had been robbed of something irreplaceable. The old cemetery keeper, Harold, had been around for as long as Ethan could remember. He was the one who had buried Maggie. And when Ethan approached him that evening with his request, Harold's expression darkened. "You want to dig up her grave, son?" Harold asked, his voice gruff and skeptical. Ethan nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Yes, I need to know. I need to see for myself what happened. I can't just let this go." Harold sighed, his old face wrinkling in concern. "I don't know, Ethan. That's not something I can just let happen without a good reason. It's illegal. You can't just go digging up graves like this. There's a process." But Ethan was determined. "I know it's wrong, but I have to do this. I need the truth." The old man hesitated. Harold had seen many things over the years, but this was something different. He could see the pain and desperation in Ethan's eyes. It was as though the young man was grasping for anything to help him make sense of the grief that was suffocating him. After a long pause, Harold reluctantly agreed. "All right, but I'm not helping you. I'll stand watch. But if anything goes wrong, I'm not responsible." With that, the two men walked together to the plot where Maggie was buried. The air felt thick with tension, and the cold breeze brushed through the trees surrounding the cemetery, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled as he dug into the earth. The noise of the shovel hitting the ground echoed in his ears. He couldn't stop now. His mind was made up. He had to know. As the hole deepened, Ethan's thoughts started to spiral. What if his suspicions were wrong? What if he was just a grieving son, trying to make sense of a random tragedy? But deep down, he knew that something wasn't right. Maggie had been so full of life, so full of energy. There was no way her death could have been as simple as it appeared. Finally, after what felt like hours of digging, Ethan's shovel struck something solid. His heart raced as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked up at Harold, who stood a few feet away, watching him closely. "It's time," Ethan said, his voice shaky. With Harold's reluctant help, they managed to lift the coffin from the ground. Ethan's hands shook uncontrollably as he reached for the lid. This was it, the moment that would either confirm his worst fears or offer him some semblance of peace. He opened it slowly, dreading what he might find inside. But what he saw when he lifted the lid would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the coffin, Maggie was not the lifeless body he expected to find. Her face was pale, but it looked peaceful, too peaceful. It was as though she had been resting, and yet, her lips were slightly parted, her hands still. But the most terrifying detail was the faint, unnatural smell of chemicals that seemed to hang in the air around her. The room seemed to grow colder by the second, and Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. His mind raced. Had someone done this? Had someone caused his mother's death? Was this a mistake? Or had she been poisoned? At that moment, Harold stepped forward, looking over Ethan's shoulder. He had seen many things in his time, but what they were staring at was beyond anything he had ever encountered. "I think you were right, Ethan," Harold said quietly, his voice filled with dread. "There's something wrong here. Something doesn't add up." Ethan's heart sank. The truth, whatever it was about to be uncovered, but in his gut, he felt a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. The answers, when they came, would change everything. As the cold air surrounded them, Ethan's mind raced. The truth was beginning to take shape, but he couldn't quite grasp it. His mother, Maggie, wasn't just gone. She had been taken from him, and the horror of realizing that someone could have been involved in her death weighed heavily on him. With the lid of the coffin wide open, he felt a sense of dread creeping up his spine, something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. Harold stood behind him, silent and still, his eyes narrowed with concern. Ethan glanced at the old man, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I don't understand. She was always healthy. Why would anyone do this to her?" The sound of his voice was the only thing breaking the silence in the graveyard. Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked closer to the open coffin and peered inside. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You're not the first to suspect something like this, son," he murmured. "But I never thought it would hit this close to home. This is beyond anything I've seen." The smell of chemicals lingered in the air. As though Maggie's body had been tampered with, Ethan was now convinced that the cause of her death was not a natural heart attack, as they had all been told. No, this was deliberate. Someone had caused her death, and Ethan would stop at nothing to find out who. The hours passed like a blur as Ethan stood frozen, staring at his mother's lifeless face. The police hadn't arrived yet, and part of him hoped they wouldn't come, at least not until he could gather more information. As much as he needed answers, he feared what the truth would uncover. He didn't know who to trust. When the police finally arrived, their presence felt almost like an intrusion. The sirens cut through the still night air, and Harold, looking more uncomfortable by the minute, took a step back. Ethan couldn't help but feel angry as the officers approached. How could they understand? How could they know the pain he was going through? "You've got a lot of explaining to do, son," one officer said, his voice stern and unwavering. "What's going on here?" Ethan turned to face the officer, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm not sure what's going on, but I need you to look at my mother's body. She didn't die of natural causes." The officer looked at him incredulously, then glanced at Harold, who nodded reluctantly. "We're going to need you to explain this properly," the officer insisted. His eyes narrowed. "Digging up a grave like this is a serious offense. You can't just go around desecrating graves without any justification." "I'm not trying to desecrate anything," Ethan shot back, his anger flaring. "I'm trying to find out the truth. I know my mother didn't die of a heart attack. She was poisoned. I'm sure of it." The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but there was something about Ethan's desperation that made them hesitate. The case wasn't clear-cut, and they had no idea what had led him to this point. They asked for the name of Maggie's doctor, but Ethan didn't have the answer. He wasn't concerned about the doctor right now. He was focused on finding the culprit. The police took statements, and Ethan could barely hold it together as he spoke. His mind was still in a whirlwind, and he felt as though everything he had ever known was being turned upside down. No one, not even the police, seemed to understand the magnitude of what had happened. As the investigation moved forward, it became apparent that Maggie had been poisoned, and the symptoms pointed to a highly potent sedative that could induce unconsciousness and even death if not properly treated. The detectives soon discovered that someone had been feeding her these drugs, slowly poisoning her without leaving any obvious signs. The evidence was damning. Maggie's death was no accident. Ethan's suspicions grew darker. He had no proof yet, but his gut told him the person responsible was someone close to him, someone who had access to Maggie and her life. That person, he realized, had been hiding behind a facade of normalcy, and Ethan had no choice but to tear that mask off. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and he couldn't ignore the pattern. The breakthrough came when the police found a set of records in Maggie's home, tucked away in a drawer that Ethan had never thought to search. There, in the files, were medical prescriptions for a powerful sedative, a drug that only a few people in the area had access to. It had been prescribed under Maggie's name, but when the pharmacy was questioned, they revealed that the prescription had been picked up by none other than Brian, Ethan's father. The truth hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. His own father, Brian, the man who had left him and Maggie all those years ago, had been the one to orchestrate his mother's death. Brian, the man who had been absent for most of Ethan's life, had returned for one thing: the life insurance money that would come with Maggie's death. Ethan's world crumbled. The man he had once looked up to, the man who had abandoned them, was the very one who had caused his mother's death. Ethan was overwhelmed with emotion, anger, grief, betrayal, and he knew, deep down, that his world would never be the same again. The next step in the investigation was to track down Brian. But when the police arrived at his home, they found it empty. Brian had fled, likely aware that his plan had been uncovered. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had been living in a nightmare for far too long. But this wasn't the end. The truth was out now, and his father would have to answer for what he had done. The hours that followed were a blur of police officers swarming Ethan's house and digging deeper into the mystery of his mother's death. His mind raced, unable to fully comprehend the horror of the situation. Brian, his own father, had killed Maggie, the woman he had loved and the woman who had always kept their family together. The realization hit him in waves, and no matter how many times he tried to suppress the anger and hurt, they kept flooding back. The police were relentless in their investigation. They interviewed neighbors, searched Brian's past for any clues, and scoured the family's history. There was one fact that stood out the most. Brian had been financially struggling before Maggie's death. The timing was too perfect for this to be anything but a calculated move. The insurance money would set him free from his financial troubles, and Maggie had become the obstacle he needed to remove. As the days passed, the hunt for Brian intensified. His disappearance sent ripples of panic through the small town. Ethan couldn't sit still, even for a moment. Every part of him wanted to confront his father, demand answers, even if it meant facing the man who had once been his hero, only to now be his worst enemy. The truth had been devastating enough, but it wasn't over. Ethan knew the only way to make this right was to make sure Brian was found and held accountable for what he had done. His mother deserved justice, and so did he. He couldn't rest until his father was caught and punished for the betrayal of a lifetime. Then, one afternoon, the phone rang. It was the police. Brian had been found. The news was a strange mix of relief and dread. Ethan had expected this day to come, but he hadn't anticipated the wave of guilt and sorrow that would crash over him when it did. Brian had been living under a false identity in a nearby town. After hearing about the investigation, he tried to flee again, but the police had already tracked his movements. The man who had once been so elusive, who had gotten away with so much for so long, was finally cornered. The arrest happened quickly. As the officers escorted Brian into the holding room, Ethan was allowed to sit down with him. His heart raced in his chest, but he knew he had to hear it from the man himself. This would be the moment when he would finally get the answers he so desperately sought. Walking into the interrogation room, Ethan saw his father sitting across from him, his face gaunt and tired, a shadow of the man he used to be. Brian's eyes flickered when he saw his son, but there was no remorse, no shame in his gaze. The man who had once been the center of Ethan's world was now nothing but a cold, distant stranger. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why? Why did you do it? Why did you kill her? She loved you. You were her whole world." Brian looked at him for a long moment before responding, his voice low and indifferent. "I never wanted to hurt her," he muttered, almost as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "But you don't understand, Ethan. We were drowning. The bills kept piling up, and then she got that insurance policy. I thought I could get out of it, you know? Start fresh. But I never meant for things to go this far." Ethan's blood ran cold as the words spilled from Brian's mouth. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't just about money. Brian had planned everything so meticulously. He had poisoned Maggie over time, using sedatives that would eventually take her life, all while hiding behind a facade of being a loving husband. Ethan had been blind to the signs, trusting a man who had never truly cared for him or his mother. The room fell silent for a moment. Brian didn't look at him anymore, staring at the floor, his face creased with regret. But it wasn't enough. Nothing would bring back Maggie. Nothing would undo the pain and the loss that Ethan had suffered. "You killed her," Ethan whispered, the words feeling heavier than any weight he had ever known. "You took her from me." Brian didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Ethan could feel the anger bubbling up inside him. But this was not the time to lash out. Brian would face the consequences of his actions. The law would make sure of that. But Ethan knew that no punishment would ever be enough to fill the hole left in his heart. As the police moved forward with the case, they soon uncovered more details about Brian's plan. The insurance policy, the illegal prescriptions, the way he had manipulated everyone around him. Everything was coming to light. The truth was undeniable. Brian was arrested and charged with Maggie's murder. His trial was swift, and the evidence stacked against him was overwhelming. Ethan watched from the sidelines, unable to be part of the courtroom proceedings. He couldn't bring himself to face his father again, not after everything that had happened. All he could do was sit back and let the justice system take its course. In the end, Brian was sentenced to life in prison, where he would never have the chance to harm anyone again. It was a small victory, but for Ethan, it was a bittersweet one. He had lost his mother, the woman who had given him life and love. And now he had lost his father, the man who had shaped his early years, but was now nothing more than a criminal in his eyes. The journey back to normalcy was long and painful. Ethan struggled to find peace, to move on from the trauma that had consumed his life. He had no one left, his family was gone, and the world felt darker without them. But in the quiet moments, he could still feel his mother's presence. She was with him in spirit, and that gave him a semblance of comfort. Months passed, and Ethan eventually found a new sense of purpose. He focused on his studies, built new relationships, and worked on healing. The wounds would never fully heal, but he learned to live with them, to carry his mother's memory with him, and to honor the woman she had been. And so, life moved forward. But for Ethan, the lessons he had learned about love, loss, betrayal, and justice would stay with him forever. He had come face to face with the worst kind of deception, but in the end, he had uncovered the truth, and that, he realized, was the only thing that mattered. End of story.